One way to look at it is that it's primitive band music. It's kind of arrested development at oompa. I look at it another way as somebody taking a fairly limited set of opportunities and creating some really very exquisite music. The instruments that they had simply don't work as well as modern instruments. What I frequently say is that we've learned an awful lot about how to build instruments in the last 150 years. A few of these instruments play really well, but all of them have idiosyncrasies that make them a challenge to play. So that's one thing that the arranger, composer, musician had to contend with, was a set of instruments that were limited in what they could do. On the other hand, never before had brass instruments, and brass equates to instruments that could play loudly, never before had instruments that could play this loudly been able to manage the chromatic scale. They were limited to the bugle call type set of overtones. So the arranger was on, in one sense, a precipice of new opportunity, and on the other hand, if he had been writing for piano or vocal music or orchestra strings, he wouldn't be facing the intonation difficulties and other limitations like that. The other thing an arranger had to contend with was that frequently the only person in the band that could read music was the cornet player. And if you had more than one or two or three people that could read music, you were really in pretty good shape. And so the music that comes out of that period, a lot of it is very heavy solo plus accompaniment, and that's a function of the players that they had available to them. The parts that they played were very, very simple. They were simple to the extent that somebody that couldn't read music very well, if at all, and somebody that couldn't read English very well, if at all, they learned to count money and sign their name, and that was as far as it went. So the arrangers were faced with these challenges of limited personnel, limited instrument capacity, and so the music did not get terribly complex. In the E-flat brass band, the key melody part was the E-flat cornet, and the middle of the band was the E-flat alto horn, and the bottom of the band was the E-flat tuba. So the band was centered in E-flat. Not that the other instruments were auxiliary, but the top, the bottom, and the middle was locked into E-flat. The B-flat cornets were written in two parts typically, and the first B-flat cornet was usually a duet part, occasionally played in unison with the E-flat cornet, but not so commonly. So it was more of a duet harmony type part. And then the first alto part frequently copied the E-flat cornet part, the E-flat melody, down an octave. And the first B-flat bass part was often a melody part down an octave, or sometimes even down 2 octaves from where the E-flat cornet was riding. The interior of the band, the rhythmic harmony of the band, was made up of the second B-flat cornet, the second alto, and the first and second tenors. And these 4 parts provided a quartet in the middle of the band that played the pa of the pa bit. And the tuba on the bottom was the harmonic structure that was on the beat. And frequently the second B-flat bass was simply a replication of the tuba part up an octave, or up an octave when they ran out of range. So the structure was pretty well defined.
All the original band members in most of these town bands brought to the party was a raw enthusiasm. Very few were trained musicians, let alone being trained on brass instruments. There were no school band programs to produce trained musicians at that time. You went to school to learn your 3 R's. The bands were manned by adults, and if you got up a town band, you quite literally ordered the set of instruments, passed them out to the fellas. Well, you feel like playing that funny looking horn there? That's called a tuba. That's a big horn. I think it's easy to blow into. Why don't you try that? And they'd read the instruction books with verbiage that would drive you absolutely crazy. How to form your lips, how to breathe properly, how to execute the proper pushing of the valve, things that we wouldn't even begin to put into a child's lesson book. Yet these adults had to use that to teach themselves, basically. A lot of people in describing town bands use colorful terms like it took a lot of mean strength and awkwardness out back of the outhouse after chores to put it together. The band masters would write to the music publishers in New York and Chicago and elsewhere, obtain music, which was usually a piano score. On the piano score, there would be hints, cornet solo here, add percussion here. But only the mere suggestion of what a bandmaster could do with this piano sheet. Sometimes they could write to the publishers and get full band scores from the likes of Patrick Gilmore or some of the other famous bandmasters at the time, and they would receive only the score, not the parts. It would be up to the bandmaster to pass it around to his bandsman, who would open up a blank music book, and they would copy their own part into their own book. So each band book that we find in the 1860s bears the distinct style of that musician who copied his own parts.
And so they were just filled with errors. And one of the problems is they copied them in ink. So the players had no good way of going back and correcting things when they made them, when they found mistakes. So I think, and this is a personal opinion, that a lot of the mistakes that you find in the original books that are clearly mistakes were never corrected because the players learned that that was a mistake and then fixed it in their head. And every time they'd play it, they'd come up and say, no, that's not really a flat, that's a natural, and we'll play it natural.
And even to this day, with the quantity of music and the advent of the computers and the ability to change and cut and paste and all that type of thing, we still have wrong notes.
That's the spot we were going to cut out, so it's worse. Mm-hmm. So that little black part you just heard was the original.
There. Yeah.
He played it that way even in the part we were cutting out.
Okay, so it's okay to cut it out, with the question being, on the edited part,
Yeah.
can we take there are 3 of those notes. Can we take the first or the third one and dub it over that?
Where are we gonna get that from?
From what?
From the edited stuff.
Section E is really 3 measures and then do it again, or 4 measures and then do it again.
Now, if you could take this one
Yeah, I see what you mean.
and stick it there.
And once in a while we'll get in a position like last night where we had somebody that had a dotted half note, another person had a half note, and we're supposed to end on 3, or no, we're going to end on 4. And we just have to fix it. Now, not many people grabbed the pencil and wrote that. The band just knows to do it. So that, I'm sure, happened a lot back then too, and especially when you had people that didn't read. I'm positive that the lining of the music, as they used to say, being able to just play a phrase, and you play that phrase until you could play it, and then add the next one, the additive process of memorization must have been a large hindrance for them, but also an advantage in that they actually knew the fingerings. Then they could work on the sound, then they could work on the pitch, then they could work on the balance and the blend, and perhaps speed and technique.
This is from the books, the original First Brigade Band. Fireman's Quick Step, this was Kimberly's book, and you can see the music is laid out rather nicely. This is the other E-flat cornet player, Faust, and except for being a little heavier with his pen, he did a nice job. This is a First B-flat cornet book, Bill Douglas. We get to second B-flat cornet, and then it gets considerably more crude. The first alto player did a reasonable job of transcribing the music, but didn't take a very good care of his book. And the second alto player has more mistakes and more problems than any place else. The first tenor book, this was Spaulding, and he knew what was going on. He did a good job. But the second tenor book is by and large a disaster. First B-flat bass was Knickerbocker. You know, he obviously just didn't have it quite as well together. Second B-flat bass is not as well handled. And this is the tuba player. May have been Stone, may have been another tuba player. But it's neat to be able to see this music and know who carried it, who probably copied it out, who had it, who played it. It's a real special feeling to be able to deal with that.
The band had its first successful performance in Beloit, Wisconsin, at a picnic and band festival where over a half a dozen bands showed up, and the band from Broadhead was declared the winner.
The First Brigade Band was considered, as I recall, by President Lincoln and others to be the best band of the Union Army. And it harkens back to a time when Wisconsin sent 50% of its adult male population to war. We had more casualties in the Civil War from Wisconsin, over 12,000, than we had in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined.
And you can shake just about every family tree, and somebody's going to drop out of the 1860s. Unless that family came after 1865, there's a descendant who fought here. There is an immigrant who came over here and willingly signed up.
We were the fuel. We were how we got from one point to the other. We provided the beat, the ability to maintain work for a long period of time. And I can't think of how long you'd have to play on that march. And I can imagine what it would have done for the drums, the people that have to carry the drums and provide cadence throughout. You know, our longest parades are 3.5 miles. You know, a little staging area ahead of that, and it's pretty challenging on a flat, nice pavement, let alone unbroken road.
The rate of march expected in 1862 or 1863 out of a typical regiment was 10 to 15 miles a day, slugging it out. And that's tough physically. It wears you down. It certainly grinds on your mental spirits. And these bands would come along and play patriotic airs. Sometimes they'd pull off to the side of the road and they'd play classical music, they'd play opera tunes, they'd play dance music, just something to make a contribution to that soldier in the ranks, to help him move along.
But my suspicion is that one of the reasons the early band music was so heavily doubled is because, particularly when they were out on the battlefield, you couldn't depend on your players to be there. The bandsmen were as subject to dysentery and fevers and other diseases as any of the soldiers were.
On a more deadly note, at the Battle of Franklin in December of 1864, General John Bell Hood launched an assault over 2 miles of open ground, twice the length of Pickett's charge, with about 3,000 to 5,000 more men that were in Pickett's charge, and he told his brass bands to go in with the assault. He told them to play the Bonnie Blue Flag over and over and over until they closed within musket range. And when the Yankees started shooting, he wanted them to play Dixie and keep on playing Dixie. And the bands in the Confederate Army were torn to shreds, just as those infantry formations were at that desperate gamble.
We consider ourselves more historians and entertainers than we do reenactors. So we're not as particular about the details we put into the dress. We might try to make them as historical as possible, using the hooks and eyes. We use elastic. They did have elastic in the 1860s, but when we're making our sleeves, our undersleeves, we use the elastic instead of the drawstrings.
The name of the game in the Civil War time, when it came to doing women's dresses, was trim. Trim, trim, trim. And today they don't have the same kind of trim, and so you end up putting several trims together in order to get one dramatic enough or wide enough or authentic looking enough.
There's a way you feel when you put on that particular outfit. Your deportment changes. You do have to stand a little straighter. You have to throw your shoulders back. You have to keep your chin up so that you don't look completely hunched over. And I think it just gives you a bearing of elegance.
For the last 17 years, I've pretended to be a man with this group,
in order to play my instrument, so now I'm pretending to be a lady. And it's been very interesting to see the differences in how the ladies view a performance, how they go into a show, the things that they're concerned about as opposed to the things I was concerned about as a musician going into a show. The first time someone said, well, all you have to do is stand there and look pretty, I really wanted to go climb in a hole somewhere, because for me, standing there looking pretty was something I didn't really know how to do.
Bracelets were extremely popular. They were large and bold. Some women wore one of each. When Fred first started the band, he was an instrument collector. So he took his instruments off the wall and called some of his musician friends and said, let's put a small group together and we're going to do a concert for the centennial year for the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable. And he called some of his buddies, and then their wives played instruments also. So they said, okay, we need like drummers or whatever the wives played. Come on in, join us. And we just put the men's uniforms on and off we went.
Now we have probably 15 to 18 women in the band, and it's kind of difficult with our modern hairstyles and everything to get it up underneath the hats and to look like a man.
The women went along with trying to look as much like men as possible. I mean, if you had long hair, it was tucked up under the hat, no makeup, no jewelry of any kind. The sack coats that we wore, which were the shorter coats, I mean, they weren't very feminine to begin with, so it was a very masculine look. And then the dark hats really lent to the, I mean, you'd be marching down the street and all of a sudden you'd hear comments, oh my gosh, there's women in there. So people didn't really realize if they were just watching you and not really looking, you know what I'm saying? They didn't notice that there were women. We just blended right in, which I guess was a good thing. So we didn't stand out. We didn't want to stand out. We wanted to blend in. But to the women that were in the band, to us it wasn't an issue, and it was never really an issue to the men that were in the band.
A lot of the women that are in right now have been in for at least 10 years and are strong players and strong members. And that's the other thing, we don't really have a competition for who plays first chair, who plays second chair. We sort of work that out between us, and quite often the women are first chair players.
We don't know of any women that were in bands back then. It doesn't mean that there weren't, because there certainly were a lot more women soldiers than they thought there were back then. So it is possible. Wouldn't have been anything they'd have encouraged a woman to do. On the other hand, you think about it, if they'd have been allowed to participate in some way, certainly that would have been a good way to do it.
A woman would pay her way in. You pay the doctor that did the examination in the first place, and that would either be money or other means. Maybe they had a prominent father in government, and that was how they passed their physical. There were many ways for women to pass that physical. Generally, they never had it in the first place.
The other issue there is that women were not trained to play band instruments back then either. They were trained to play parlor instruments, about as far as they usually went. With a band instrument might have been a flute, a guitar.
Women have been pretending to be men in military actions for a very long time. And I don't think that me pretending to be a man to reenact this band is any different than a woman back in the 1860s cutting off her hair, binding her breasts, and being by her brother's and father's side at the battlefields.
What would have been the emotional impact of a raggedy sounding out of tune band on a farmer from Broadhead who had never heard the Chicago Symphony, who had never heard synthesized music, who had never heard the Canadian brass? But you've heard the Canadian brass. And when you hear us, there's going to be a comparison made in your head.
The authenticity argument is always one that is paradoxical, and the more we strive to be perfect, perhaps we are getting further away from what was really there. I don't think that we're ever intentionally trying to do that. I think it's something that's a byproduct of getting better at what we do.
Our median level of playing is probably much higher than what the 1860s bands would have had. And so I think what we're doing is emulating the finer bands that you would have heard. And there were bands then that were essentially professional bands. You know, what we probably sound like is more like the Marine Band out of Washington, D.C. than we actually sound like the First Brigade would have sounded.
The town bands of those days that would sign up were already established and had a book or a repertoire of musical songs that they would play. I truly feel that the Broadhead Band, having already won a contest and had been asked to go off and participate with the Lincoln-Douglas debates, they were decent performers to begin with.
The First Brigade Band, after going on the tours that they did, they probably played really well together because they did it on a daily basis for quite a long time.
But some of those bands had to get technically really good. I still question just how good they sounded. But when it came to playing a lot of notes really fast, they had to be doing it.
Something I don't really care much for are the high-pitched, high-tension drums that are used in modern drum and bugle corps. I just find it uninteresting. I recall being in parades outdoors as a kid with a drum that had a calf head, and if you didn't have a drum key in your pocket, you were in real trouble because the head would sag as the day wore on, and you had to just keep tightening the thing to maintain any degree of tension and playability. So you had to have the key. And with a rope and leather drum, you've always got the leather, so you can always pull it up more. But then there's a limit to how far it can be pulled up.
And in this day and age, the drums are truly unique. They have calfskin heads, they're wooden barrels, rope tension, and catgut snares. And the sound can, on a damp day, can sound just like an oatmeal box that you played when you were a kid.
But you have to occasionally pull these drums up because the ropes stretch. And if you try to maintain tension just with the leathers, you can't get enough tension to make it playable. So you got to go back and re-rope the thing.
It's terribly. So these are the clarinets. This one is dated approximately 1840, and the E flat is dated approximately 1860 to 1850. And these are both 12 to 13 key instruments. This one happens to be a low-pitched horn, which makes it less difficult to do with the band. The high-pitched horns are terribly sharp.
Ed watched me do this once, and he said it reminded him of a sausage factory, which I thought was unkind.
Much of it is a hallucination, right? Yeah.
Yeah, together you get something different.
Yeah.
Can we put the cords back in the truck?
It sort of depends on how you want to do this.
You can feel the horn vibrate a lot of times when you're playing it, just more than you can a modern horn. It's not so stiff, it gives more, and that kind of thing. And as a result, it's for someone who wants to play with an instrument and work with the intonation and the tuning, they're almost more fun to play that way. They can be very irritating to play too.
It's sort of like looking the other way when you don't want to see something. Well, a lot of times we've got to hear the other way. You've got to learn to listen for where the real pitch center is. And that if you're listening in the wrong place sometimes, it might be that this horn over here is really having problems with that pitch because of the way the horn's built. And if you listen to it and try to affect how you're have a sense of intonation, then you're going to be led astray.
And they'll play differently depending on the key you're playing in too. The one I have now, it always surprises me that in the flat keys, I usually have to play my A's with the third valve. In the sharp keys, it sounds better with them played 1 and 2, which is inherently sharper, but it just seems to tune better with the chords that way.
If I adjust this slide, will you not mess up, or I'm having problems with my second valve right now? You know, what do I have to do to get you to work here a little bit? And you pamper it, you put a little oil in the right place, and maybe it'll last for the next week or two.
If you want to play it well, you really got to sit down and shake hands with it for a while and make compromises with it. The horn that I play is really pretty small board. It just doesn't work down low very well. Since I'm playing lead tenor, I'm playing up in the stratosphere most of the time, and then it performs like a champ. But down low, it's just a dog. And a lot of times it's disappointing to me that I can't, you know, there's this great line that the baritones have, and I want to play it. But I can't, because the horn just won't speak that.
When this horn gets in any sun, it goes incredibly sharp. So, you know, you have to be willing to accept that and not blame the horn for what it is or is not capable of doing. When I play up a scale on my modern horn, it's pretty effortless. The horn does most of the work. On my little E-flat horn, I have to constantly adjust to get each note to play in pitch. And so it's kind of like working with a cranky child, I guess, that you have to kind of coax it to get it where you want it to go.
Most of these instruments, with the exception of some of the bigger horns, you know, you really can't push really hard. You can't make them into what you want to make them. You just have to kind of compromise with them. And
the little E-flat horn that I play is fairly bright, and he thinks it's perhaps a bit too bright and wanted me to play this other horn that has a darker tone to it. And I think that it plays perhaps in tune better when I run up a scale, but it's cranky in its own way, in that if you're putting a lot of air through it and getting a lot of volume, it's just fine. It's a great outdoor horn, but indoors it's kind of like a bull in a china shop. There are some horns that some people simply cannot play, and it's kind of like you're cursed when you pick up that particular horn. I guess I've been with my little E-flat horn so long that it's a good friend, and a friend that I know I can trust. It will not let me fall off a note like the bigger horn will.
It's the collection of horns that brings together the collection of individuals. And I think that's real vital. The collection's important because we let the collection be what it is, a playing collection.
maybe we think of them as like a horn family by now. I'm not really sure, but most of the people know the nicknames of their horns. Most of them are interested enough to ask why they're called that.
The collection provides us with a focus around which to come together, and it brings this group of individuals together to do something very special. We can only do it once in a while. I mean, once a week on Friday nights we get together. But without the collection, that doesn't happen.
And I think that's one of the things that this band does better than many other organizations, is it tends to focus on the task at hand and is less wrapped up in what somebody's reaction is going to be.
I think we've played concerts in front of 12 people and have done just wonderful, inspired performances because the group itself focuses on the performance itself rather than on some of the other activities that might be going on around it.
We have one that I bought from the band that was at the time called the Wall Hanger, and now it's called Patches.
In the middle of one show, and I couldn't tell you when it was or where it was, an elderly man from the audience, after one of the patriotic pieces that we had played, made his way very slowly. None of us, we were all a little apprehensive. We had no idea what was going to happen, up to the corner of the stage, and he picked up the Civil War, the period Union flag, and kissed it, and turned around and went back and sat in his seat. It was strange, but it was wonderful too. We obviously had touched him, touched something in him that stirred a great deal of emotion, and it was a touching moment. I guess that's about what I'd have to say about who we are and what we do. They're starting rehearsal. This is why we call it rehearsal. Some rehearsals start more quickly than others. The musicians in the band are not, most of them are not professional musicians. As I mentioned, I have no professional musical training. Most of us are here, well, I'm sure there are a variety of reasons. Some people are very much into the history of the band. Some people are very much into the music. We certainly have some very accomplished musicians that play with us regularly. Some people are here primarily for the social aspects. Some are fascinated by the history. What always amazes me on the occasions when I'm away from the band, as now, it's rare for me to be sitting and hearing the First Brigade play and not playing myself. What always amazes me is that when the group finally gets going, and as I said, rehearsal is kind of slow to start sometimes, but what always amazes me is the quality of the music that this group produces for a bunch of amateurs who are not getting paid, who are giving up family gatherings and doing the things that all of us have friends who do normal things. It always amazes me how wonderful the band can sound. The band played at my wedding, and my comment to the band afterwards was it was distressing how good they sounded without me. So it's fun.
First Brigade Band, 3 cheers for Dan. Huzzah! 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 Huzzah!